You're listening to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast, episode 160. Chef Karen McAthy is on the show to speak with me about fear and misinformation related to so-called processed foods and new plant-based food products that are coming to market.
Welcome to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast. Myth-busting and evidence-based advice to help you kick butt with your health and fitness on a vegan diet. Here's your host, Karina Inkster.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Karina, your go-to no BS vegan fitness and nutrition coach. Today, my guest and I are discussing food and nutrition on a very macro level, and not macro as in macronutrients, but a macro scale, which I think needs to happen more on this show, so I'm very excited for that. Now, if you'd like to look at your own nutrition on a more detailed level, you can download our portion guide, which is an alternative to calorie counting. Test out our vegan protein calculator, and read about the 15 micronutrients that are extra important for vegans, all at karinainkster.com/resources. Introducing my guest today, Chef Karen McAthy. Karen, a lifelong resident of BC's West Coast, is an innovator in dairy-free, vegan, plant-based cultured cheese and plant-based cuisine. Co-founder of former consumer packaged goods brand Blue Heron and parent company Lumi Foods, Karen's focus on innovation in plant-based foods is linked to understanding the complex systems of food from growing to finished goods. Currently, Karen is developing starter and adjunct cultures for commercial use in the cultured vegan cheese and dairy alternative sector. I had Chef Karen on the show way back in episode 34, which you should definitely check out if you haven't already. That was the most interesting discussion about cheese I've ever had. Karen addressed the myth that something can be called cheese only if it's made with dairy, the idea of cheese as a process, not only an end product, the differences between types of vegan cheeses, and a whole lot more. So again, that's episode 34 of this show. You can find it in your podcast listening app of choice or at nobullshitvegan.com/034. Today, Chef Karen and I have a wide-ranging conversation about misinformation that's creating pushback against certain vegan foods, how veganism often gets conflated with health, and much more. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Karen. Welcome back to the show. Nice to speak with you again.
Yeah, great to be back and nice to see you again.
I think it was episode 34, if I'm not mistaken. And now we're like in the 150s, possibly the 160s. So it's been a while since Karen's been on the show. So I'm glad you're back.
Well, and congratulations for surpassing the 100 episode mark, too.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I never guessed. I started it in 2018 and I was like, well, there's maybe 8 or 10 folks that would be cool to speak with, and then that's it. And now look where we are. So you never know.
Well, congratulations, because that's a big goal to achieve in the podcasting realm.
Well, thank you. So we have very wide-ranging and connected topics to talk about today. I was kind of thinking of a starting off point because we've had a couple of discussions before meeting today about what we want to talk about and how we want to approach it and that kind of thing. So one thing that we were discussing before is this concept of black and white thinking and how rampant it is in not just the fitness and the nutrition industries, but in veganism. And often in veganism, it's around things like ethical versus non-ethical, or healthy versus non-healthy or unhealthy. And this whole approach really prevents nuanced discussions, which is what we're going to try to do today. And so around this idea of black and white thinking, Karen, something that you've mentioned is there seems to be this growing pushback against some plant-based product innovations that are coming out around things being, quote, too processed or, quote, too unhealthy. And it's just general fear-mongering around certain ingredients. And we can talk about some of those ingredients today in our conversation. Whenever I hear, if you can't pronounce it, it shouldn't be in your food, or the poor use of the word chemicals to mean toxins, I think that the wellness industry is capitalizing on half or partial truths to spread misinformation that ultimately rewards the proponents of such notions with clout or economic gain. So those are some excellent points that you made, and all points I want to go into today.
Yeah, those sound like some fighting words coming from
Yeah,
me.
they are. They are fighting words, yes. But I feel like, you touched on economic gain. You touched on just general clout being received from speaking this way about foods and the fear-mongering and all of that.
Mhm.
So maybe we can kind of start on the idea of fear itself, or maybe it's uncertainty. I'm not entirely sure what the right word is for this, but it's what some folks are feeling around plant-based food innovations or new products that are coming to market that are plant-based. Why is fear involved in the first place?
And that's such a great question. And as someone who's an innovator in the food space and has delivered to market a novel product and has had to face to face with consumers, skepticism, anger, fear, nervousness, anxiousness. One, food is so highly personal that it's very easily going to be a center point for other sort of larger scale fears, anxiety, nerves, uncertainty. But at the same time, our general knowledge around how food is produced, whether it's from growing to finished goods, is actually pretty limited. It's aside, like there's pockets of people who know things, but overall, I think almost everybody has a fairly low level understanding of all the many things that go into how we get food onto our plate when it's not grown directly or produced directly by our own hands. I'm trying to say this with quite a lot of grace for the fear part of, or the anxiety part of things. When we are not familiar with something, I think that's pretty classically true of humans in general. Our first response tends to be from a place of anxiety or uncertainty versus a little bit more openness. So, and maybe some of that's hardwired from an evolutionary perspective with regard to just protection, but culturally it converts into more problematic things where we use our own particular lens and our own layer of knowledge to then project it outward as though that's somehow an overarching truth or the maximization of the knowledge. So let's say if I only ever know X, Y, and Z about something, and I assume that's what only exists in terms of the knowledge, and then I speak on that particular food or that topic from that place, then that's already cutting off, that's already making an assumption that there maybe isn't more to learn about that or more to understand about that. And so with respect to food, and I think people tend to speak from that place of their personal experience first before all other perspectives enter the chat, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I feel like this could be applied to any number of topics, not just food, that we are not necessarily experts in, which is probably why there's so much misinformation in general out there, but that's a whole other discussion.
I just think food just tends to be that particularly hyper-personal place that opens that door really readily. So when a new food item comes to market, and we're in a particularly weird time right now where I think politically and culturally and particularly in North America, where this idea of challenging established knowledge or challenging so-called elites or so-called experts seems to be a prominent process right now, that it's really left this idea that somehow opinion equals knowledge as a viewpoint to understanding things. So with respect specifically to novel foods, if something is being produced in a way that's not familiar to the majority of people, they tend to adopt sort of a fear-based approach to understanding it. So the idea of looking at something like a cheese not made from animal milk becomes a really big hot button topic. And the irony or the funny part is that with a rare exception, most people that respond to it angrily actually don't really have much of an idea how dairy cheese is produced itself anyway.
Good point.
They just know that there's some milk and that maybe a thing happens, but they don't actually have a particularly deep knowledge of all the processes that can transform this one substance into many different kinds of cheese substances. So I'm not really sure how internally they make the leap that automatically a plant version of that is unhealthy or dangerously high processed, when there isn't even a universally accepted definition for something like ultra high processed. But from my experience in one-on-one conversations and emails and direct messages and things like that, I think even amongst the friendlies in the community, there is an assumption that the ingredient list on some things they've seen equates to either equally bad or dangerous, or and then therefore maybe all dairy-free cheeses are produced in exactly the same way. So when they enter it from just this limited knowledge but try to apply it broadly without actually asking questions about how is that actually made or what does that actually mean, they've cut out all of this other stuff and it's just fear, anxiety talking. That's my perception. Mm-hmm. Some people will really dig in their heels around that idea of being able to pronounce all the ingredients on a list and equate that to somehow safety. But I think that's where the fear comes from, is in misunderstanding. I'm not really sure how we got to a place where it's become such a ubiquitous force in the food conversation, but it's become pretty prominent. Like, it's almost the most dominant feature of most conversations around food.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making a lot of really good points. And I feel like the actual BS busting around individual ingredients is probably one piece of the puzzle. And we've on the podcast chatted with folks like Dr. Matt Nagra, who really, really BS bust the whole idea that seed oils are bad for us somehow. So, there's like individual ingredients that we can look at. But I think zooming out and looking at overall why this is happening and where this anxiety and fear comes from, a lot of the times it is because folks are unfamiliar with something, and unfamiliarity, for whatever reason, is correlated with being bad for us or, anxiety, fear. Just as an example, one time I put up a post on Facebook, just a list of ingredients. And I was like, hey, would you guys eat this? It was probably in a vegan, I don't know, food group or something. Anyways, so I posted this whole list of ingredients. It was like capric acid, E300, E306, tocopherol, ethyl hexandate, like ethyl butanoate, etc., etc. I'm like, hey, would you eat this? And people are like, no, because it has weirdly named chemicals in it. And I'm like, you do realize it's a banana, right? Like, I'm just listing the chemical ingredients of a banana.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing, I think, is part of the picture too, this whole concept that we're still being told by so-called nutrition and fitness influencers, if you can't pronounce the ingredient, you probably shouldn't eat it. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that is where I have less issue or beef with consumer individuals having anxiety, fear, but I have issue with people who position themselves as being figures of authority,
right,
and transmitting knowledge when they are lazy,
right,
in their communication of that information.
Right.
Now that this idea of expertise has now moved down into like the Instagram or the TikTok level, so quote unquote has democratized expertise, I suppose, in a certain sense. I think there's an obligation then, as if you're transmitting something that's meant to be beyond just sort of like, I like this or I don't like that. I think there's an obligation to be better informed in what you're sharing and not going into grocery stores and pointing at ingredient lists and saying, right, this is bad.
Exactly.
And because chemicals equaling toxins is probably one of my biggest pet peeves out there. And
agreed.
It incredibly frustrates me when I hear nutritionists and naturopaths and others equate chemicals to toxins, because that couldn't be more inaccurate. Mm-hmm. We are made of chemicals. We could do a chemical breakdown of what is in blood. Mm-hmm. We could do a chemical breakdown of skin. We are chemicals. We are atoms. And so when I see people, and even when I see fellow food producers rely on that tool, as a marketing tool to suggest better than. I think it's lazy and appeals to low-hanging fruit perhaps, but I don't think it actually ultimately does a service towards either allowing for better products to be developed and brought to market, or for better consumer knowledge of understanding the food system or food processes. So when we just rely on that as a trope for communicating expertise, I think it's dangerous a little bit, to be frank.
I would fully agree. I mean, we could do a whole podcast episode just on busting that myth.
Just on that.
But I mean, you've already touched on all the points. We're all chemicals. Everything we eat is chemicals. Chemicals does not equal toxins. I think that is the main point.
Not even remotely. And stuff, when we say the word natural, so this is safe because therefore it's natural, equally dangerous.
Arsenic is natural.
Dangerous. Chemicals that we encounter, right? That we shouldn't just ingest because it's natural, or they only become safe for consumption because we have to apply a process such as heat to transform them and those sort of things. So using these catchwords of natural and chemical equals toxin and natural equals good, I think it's unfortunate in that we're relying on people not being willing to want to know more or better knowledge in order to make that move. And I don't think that does anybody a service, whether, even including the person like who's sending that information out there. I don't think it actually does them a service either. One of my favorite health quote unquote influencers is Dr. Ids, who routinely calls out bad information in really methodical ways, where he pulls lists of data and lists of research articles and then tries to explain the difference between a meta-analysis and individual studies. Because when people start jumping into the pseudo sharing of data, they don't do the hard work of then explaining where that data came from, what were the parameters of that data, because it matters. It matters if the original researchers are only looking at this tiny lens versus like extrapolating it further. It matters if it was just an initial study versus the ongoing work of science, which is then to do multiple comparative studies and have more than one party replicate the outcome. So I enjoy watching him methodically take on a lot of these people who walk into grocery stores and point at labels and say bad.
I'm going to have to look up this person because he's not on my radar yet. So this sounds like a perfect addition to the no bullshit professionals.
Yeah, he takes it on. He takes it on head on, which I appreciate. So, I mean, I could ramble on, as I think I am, but this moves into the, like, in this arena of things, it moves into things like when we're saying living water versus tap water. And when we're talking about things that are as essential to what we need, like water, oxygen, and food, or the three, and housing, of course, but like bodily, those three things we need. And when we're talking about these things as though living water is somehow better for us than tap water, but nobody's talking about what living water actually means. And nobody's applying the microscope and going, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should understand what constitutes living water.
Or toxins, for that matter. You ask anyone who's peddling some kind of cleanse what the toxins actually are, and they have no clue. Exactly.
Yeah. And that the things that we think that can have a toxic load in the body are, like, you rarely hear the people who sell cleanses talking about the role of the kidney and the liver.
Exactly.
And how they actually do function. And people who peddle alkaline water never talk about the fact that the body itself doesn't have a singular pH state.
Exactly.
Our blood pH state is very different than what our lungs and our heart or our brain require. So there isn't some magical state of one uniform pH that is perfect for maintaining human health.
Exactly.
But you never hear the people who are selling these technologies talk about that. And so they benefit when they avoid good information. They benefit when they they continue to perpetrate like the lowest level of pseudo scientific sounding information. And then the alt wellness naturopath nutrition realm is as big an industry as quote unquote big pharma is.
Absolutely.
And so this mythology that somehow it's alternative to that is questionable, I think.
To say the least.
At least. And that's not to suggest, I actually am a big proponent of like having multiple modalities to like sustaining one's health and wellness. But when they say if you're entering into a financial deal, if it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Well, the same thing absolutely applies if a product is trying to suggest that it can cure or solve a lot of things. Quite likely it can't.
Right, exactly. Red flag number 1 right there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I feel like we need to touch on one slight diversion because we're talking a lot about health. And I think in the vegan world, veganism is often conflated with health. And sure, there are some folks who are thinking about health and some folks who go vegan for health reasons. But I think we just need to put on the table that veganism at its core is not about health. It's an ethical system, right? And then within that system, what we're doing is adhering to a plant-based diet, whether or not we have health as part of the deal. So I feel like, as soon as you tell someone who isn't vegan that you're vegan, the first thing they'll start spouting at you is like, oh, well, processed meats aren't healthy. And, oh, don't you need to take supplements? And it becomes a health thing. And I'm like, dude, I didn't even mention health. Did I not? I didn't tell you why I'm vegan, which for me, by the way, even as a fitness person, is not related to health. I did not go vegan for health reasons. So I just thought we maybe should put that on the table as a background.
No, 100%, because as someone who's brought a product to market in the consumer packaged goods realm, vegan food products have a higher virtue standard to which they're expected to uphold on the market than almost anything else. So they're expected to be delicious. They're expected to perform well in all culinary applications, regardless of someone's knowledgeability or intent of use. They're expected to be nutritionally at the top of the game, and they're expected to be all the things all at one time. And it's because I think once you're outside the vegan community, there has absolutely been a conflation of this idea of the plant-based diet and health. And some of that comes from like the use of studies that have shown that a whole foods plant-based diet is generally like healthier than other forms of diets. And so then when plant curious folks or omnivores who are trying to reduce their animal product intake become the larger consumer set, their expectation of the health component drives that conflation. But without a nuanced understanding of the word vegan not actually meaning anything related to food inherently. Like, in fact, yeah, that it's an ethical system. I've had this conversation a lot with at multiple levels of my journey, and sort of explaining that when you, to a meat eater, saying when you go and eat a beef burger, you're not eating that because that's health food. You're eating that because you want something delicious and juicy. Well, the same reason that somebody who wants to eat a vegan burger wants it to be messy and delicious and all of those things, they're not eating it because they're trying to get their fiber and protein alignment right for the day.
Exactly.
They're eating it because they enjoy it. And there can be ethical vegans who subsist off lots of less nutritious food, let's say, like food that probably should only be occasional versus the dominant part of your diet, like lots of chips and lots of delicious vegan chocolate and things like that. So I think trying to ensure a thriving product market variety for people who choose to eat in the plant-based lifestyle, I think it's problematic when that conflation of health and plant-based or health and vegan is made, because then it limits the market opportunity for people bringing products to market. It actually limits or constrains the ability to bring a product that's been created through processes that may be newer, because now you have to overcome this barrier around education and have to deal with this wall of the health not health question right away or in advance of. And it also assumes there's only one way to be healthy in all of that, I think, when that becomes what happens.
Well, it makes a lot of assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah, but 100% that's what's sort of happened out there, is that plant-based eating and vegan specifically equates healthier. And I certainly encountered that in one of the last restaurants I helmed before jumping off on my own, where the general manager, he himself was not ethically vegan, but had adopted a plant-based diet. And whenever he would talk to customers about it or why he did it, it was never about he did it for the environment or he did it because of the animals. It was always because, well, I lost 60 pounds.
Right. Right.
I'm like, well, all that just tells me is that how you were eating before was wildly different than the calories you're taking in now.
Exactly.
And that maybe your activity level changed.
Well, there's a lot of assumptions, right? And also, I think this whole discussion leaves out the fact that a lot of folks go vegan entirely for ethical reasons and not for health reasons, or maybe entirely for environmental reasons and not health reasons. I mean, we don't know, but it leaves out a lot of the discussion, which seems to be a theme in our chat around, missing pieces of information.
Well, and it really is in the consumer product market, because in the roundtables I've been part of, and in reading the consumer reports and who tends to purchase the products, is that the ethical vegans, and I count myself as one of them, so i.e. the people that chose our pathways because we care about how other sentient creatures are treated in the food system and otherwise, we're not the biggest consumer portion.
Right, that's a good point.
Our reasons for doing so don't become the top reasons a retailer cares to bring the product to market. So if a retailer is adopting a new product, they're going to adopt the products that will reach the broadest group of people that are seeking those products. And currently right now, it's ostensibly under the notion of health that seems to be driving that purchase decision, and sometimes environment, but it's mostly sort of seems to be the health seeking crowd that's driving some of that.
That's a good point.
So yeah, at the same time, there's no lack of vegan snacks out there, but the expectation is that they also need to be healthy, and I'm doing air quotes for that.
Yes. Healthy in air quotes, yeah. Well, I was speaking with the co-founder and CEO of Next Level Burger, and he said the vast majority of his customers are not vegan or anywhere on the vegan spectrum. So the business piece and who your target audience is, who your market is, who your customers are, I mean, that's always going to be a big piece of the puzzle. So I think that's actually important to keep in mind for this discussion.
It is, because from when you're in the producer end of it, even if you've come in from the ethical place, and is that the decisions that you have to make to get that product to market and keep it there, the ethical part becomes the background part. And the objective, at least for me, was always to try to keep that at least on the conversational table.
Right.
But contemporarily, there's been so 2020, there was that big bubble around plant-based and all the excitement and the market for plant-based foods. But there's been a really big pushback. And so we're in that trough right now that often follows a peak and sort of just starting to come out it. But part of what's happened in that softening is that a lot of meat companies that did have plant-based lines canceled their lines. People have started promulgating studies or partial studies that are, putting the consumption of meat back in. Consumption rates of things like chicken have actually gone up, not down. And demand for animal meat hasn't really softened as much as I think us on the ethical side of the table would like to see. And so when that happens, and then the open part of the consumer base that does want to still keep plant-based open, what we're all being told again now is that putting vegan on your package could be a detriment and not not a selling feature.
It's not a marketing buzzword anymore.
And that it's actually been shown to inhibit people's purchasing decisions right now. And this is at the same time as that finally, like in Canada, there's finally some formalization happening around what the V symbol means. Like when you put that symbol on the pack, it will soon have to meet a standard in order for you to be able to put that on your package. So it's a bit of an irony that at the same time that is being defined is that there's also this V word coming across as an inhibition on purchase. So for people in the product market side, hard decisions have to be made around how do you keep that product there and keep that space open, that shelf space availability open for plant-based products. So the Plant-Based Food Association here in Canada, I think, is doing a lot of work in that realm. But for the individual producers, this produces a significant challenge.
That's an interesting point. I feel like, I mean, we could use like an example of a specific product, perhaps, to illustrate some of these things. So one specific type or group of products is plant-based milks, which have received a ton of pushback actually from the dairy industry itself, and possibly some of what you've mentioned around, companies that weren't inherently vegan companies that had a plant-based option, then pulling it back due to lack of demand or whatever it was. But I think the plant-based milk as a specific product is maybe an example of some of these things that are occurring in the industry. And it also includes ingredients that are being vilified unreasonably, like seed oils, right?
Yes, exactly. Ironically, though, that's probably the wrong use of the word, but plant-based milk has actually been probably one of the most successful categories of plant-based products, in that it has meaningfully declared shelf space and has opened, like it's actually caused shrinking of dairy space, and actually some dairies. Some previous animal dairies have converted to plant-based production, and there's a new one in the Netherlands that's doing so. But certainly on the topic around like the seed oil question, and specifically the canola,
Okay.
as a humectant in oat milks, the amount of outrage. Misplaced outrage, and I'm okay with saying that. It's misplaced outrage around the understanding of the role the canola oil or rapeseed oil is doing there. It's required to keep the substrate stable so it doesn't just have all the solids land. Probably some of the most frustrating is it's not just opponents from dairy that question this usage, but there's also plenty of vegans that challenge it by saying you can make your own plant-based milk at home. It's super easy, and you don't need to add all these things. I'm like, yeah, you absolutely can make that version of plant milk at home, but will it perform equally or the same in certain applications? Probably not. And because one, the at-home equipment doesn't produce the fine shear that you need to break down the plant material.
Good point.
A lot of the use of something like a beta amylase, which is simply just an enzyme that helps break down the protein structure, allows for that mixture now to become more consistent throughout and therefore stable. Plant milks are getting challenged on those kinds of things for not great or well understood reasons, other than, again, is I don't understand this ingredient, so I'm going to say bad. And canola's got a bad rap. But there are sectors in the vegan product market that are coming up more where that challenge is going to get even bigger, or even before it even hits the market. And that in plant meat, there has been brewing for a number of years, and the work is very serious and ongoing. But the idea of cultured meat, or the use of processes called things like precision fermentation, which is using yeast or filamentous fungi to produce animal-free proteins that are then used to create products that in the animal meat or animal protein replacement market. And those products in Europe already, they're facing bans without any real effort to understand the processes or the technology or the product quality after that, or the product safety after that. There's just this sort of protectionist fear approach to it that's just saying no. And I'm a little surprised in that I haven't seen strong responses coming back saying, but this is actually how cattle farmers breed their cows. And I'm not talking about just the animal cruelty part of it. I'm talking about, but what are they doing when they are selecting for certain breeds of animals to produce a certain amount of muscle? And there's research projects that are actively being done to cultivate animals that will produce less methane and that will be able to digest different ranges of material, and where feedstock is being developed that will help aid in reducing methane. Like, I think the lobbies on that front have been mildly successful in that they've managed to re-romanticize the home on the land kind of approach, and be, look, it's just a farmer in a field with the cows and this is natural, instead of talking about any of all of that other much more intense technological side that goes into the replication of herds, or even on plant side, when people, and I confess readily that I tend to be more whole foods plant based than some other things, and that's probably more because I just cook a lot for myself at home anyway. But when people are saying, well, ultra high processed foods, but look, it's a blueberry, it's natural, it's fine. I'm like, yeah, but do you know that a cultivated blueberry actually tastes nothing like its wild type? Like nothing. Doesn't taste anything like it. A wild blueberry is incredibly tart compared to the sweetness of cultivated blueberries. And that to grow blueberries, or that to grow most of the food, at least I will speak to British Columbia, but most of the produce that's grown in British Columbia requires every season during the flowering season that beekeepers bring their hives in to ensure pollination occurs. It's not just wild bees out there that are doing this that that ensure that a whole blueberry crop can be produced or such. There's all of these layers of how that whole blueberry that's natural, that's not processed, has actually, there's been a ton of things that happen before that even gets to you.
Right.
The research on the type of the species that'll grow well, the research on how that in order to get a highly productive crop, you have to grow, I think it's between 2 to 4 different varieties of blueberry, because just growing one variety won't give you a good yield. When we oversimplify, or when we erase at least some of the complexity, we actually are dumbing ourselves down. We're not, to be frank.
Well, again, that seems to be the trend in all of these things, where it's really just one very small piece of the puzzle and you're missing out on a lot of pertinent information. Like what's the background? How was it produced? What's the technology involved? Compared to what? You have to ask all these questions. And nobody seems to be doing that, which is not doing our movement any good.
It isn't doing the movement any good, and it's not going to actually open a market to have more. If the idea is that better product market fit can actually get more people to eat more plants, and there's no one type of vegan, because everybody that has come in for a multitude of reasons, but it's not actually furthering that objective along when we don't actually have an understanding around how the food system functions. So, and even when we're talking about things for climate, and increasing the use of pulses, and that is that farmers, in order with changing climate, are having to develop new pulse types of plants that can withstand longer periods of drought. So when people are like, it came from, again, this idea of this pseudo simplicity of it came from the plant, therefore it's good, is really just erasing what it takes to ensure that plants can sustain climate changes that are happening, and what's required to make that happen. It's not really the simple thing. And I think if anybody has grown something at home, it wouldn't be that hard for them to actually if they stopped and paused, go, wait, I planted 15 tomato plants and only 2 were productive, or
right,
things like that might start to give you some insight into oh, maybe it isn't just as easy as that.
Well, it usually isn't. There's usually a lot of info that we're missing out on, and maybe in some sense it's also like bad science that's informing decisions. That's probably also part of the piece is like, well, what's the actual quality of the information that is supposedly being used in all of these arguments? So it's not just that we don't have the information, it's where's the information coming from?
100%. I think quality of information and actually knowing how to recognize quality of information is quite important. And reading a research study isn't actually super easy inherently, right? Like, if you don't understand how a study was set up and what the tools of the study were, then it can actually be a challenge to compare two different studies that seem to offer competing information. So I think there's actually a role for people capable of reading that work and disseminating it in an accessible way. By the time we see something in a headline or in a newspaper or that's communicated at the lay level, almost all the important nuance has been pulled away from it.
Absolutely.
And usually the one that most of the credible scientists will leave in there, this only applies to this range of things, or this requires further investigation. Those two statements often get hidden away or pulled away from a catchy study title.
Oh yeah, those are never going to make it into the headline. Absolutely not. Karen, didn't you once have an experience, and you don't have to go into detail, but didn't you once encounter this type of simplistic thinking where someone passed on an opportunity because the product ingredients contained seed oils and they're like, nope, hard pass just because of that?
Well, our products don't actually contain seed oils, but it was because they were plant-based and they equated. Somehow this man with quite a lot of power and a lot of money equated seed oils with fermentation of plant protein. I don't know what magical leap he did in his head to do that, but that is sort of what happened, because I was describing our process of fermentation and what fermentate, because he asked me, so I was trying to explain it at a very base level what fermentation does in our case. And then he somehow just made a leap to like somehow extracting oils and protein from the nuts would be bad because there's some worry about it being bad in seed oils. But it effectively stopped the conversation because in his head he had decided that was a hard stop.
Well, yeah. Bizarre. But this is the simplistic thinking at work. This is, we're not just talking about consumers making their own decisions, which is a huge part of the deal, but we're also talking about high-powered folks making business decisions. We're talking about brands and how they further them. We're talking about whether or not new products make it to market. I mean, it's not just individual folks we're talking about here.
100%. It's systemic, like all things, right? There's multiple layers to how all of this turns into something, and so trying to figure out how to undo some of that and not have people become instantly afraid or uncomfortable with the idea of new processes being applied to generate food types. It starts with trying to figure out how to make sure good information gets disseminated and shared as widely as bad information does.
Right. Hey, that's a pretty good litmus test, actually. We know we're succeeding when the evidence-based information is making it as far as the pseudoscience.
Yeah, exactly. That is a good litmus test.
So, Karen, you have some consulting opportunities. I don't know a ton about what you're offering. Can you share a little bit about these?
Sure. I'm in a bit of a transition, but I'm working on I'm offering consulting and working with some small scale to medium sized food producers around a range of things. Product development and research and development are key offerings, as well as helping people navigate programs like the Scientific Research and Economic Development filings, or SHRED, as it were, so that helps them reclaim finances from the federal government for work they're doing. And also anything around scale to market, helping people navigate those kinds of challenges. A broad range of sort of the business development rounds specifically for food companies.
Oh, very cool. That's awesome. And we are going to have show notes as usual, so folks can connect with you if they're in that realm or otherwise want to connect with Karen. Is there anything you want to leave our listeners with? Like, we kind of talked at a pretty high level about a lot of these concepts, which I think is important. Why do we think these things? Where does information come from? Why is there fear involved? But any sort of, like action steps that we, including me as an individual, can take? Any kind of last thoughts?
Maybe it's a nerd in me, but I don't think it would hurt people to find online courses on basic science reading or basic science education. To be frank, that may be unconventional advice, and it's certainly not as crippy as other kinds of things I could say. But I do think making oneself ready to actually understand more deeply means like going and finding the means to do so. And so there are lectures at universities or at food groups or in different places that talk about these topics. Go and join one of them. Don't just take the Facebook or social media thread you're in as the primary source of information. Get offline, go and read some articles, go and find some good science educators that can help to like demystify some things.
I think that's fantastic advice. Just as a little aside on that topic, I never learned how to properly assess the quality of research, how to properly do lit reviews until I was in graduate school. I didn't even learn that in my undergrad degree properly.
Oh, wow.
So, it probably depends what area you're in. You're doing research papers and you're writing essays, and of course you're doing that in undergrad, but full-on lit reviews, the statistics involved, how to tell what size of an effect they found. I didn't do all that stuff until grad school. And so I think it should, A, be taught way earlier, maybe not at quite that level of intensity, but we don't really have anything that's like that in our public school system at this point. And so I think what you're saying is you got to take it upon yourself at this point.
And I do think there should be something like that much, much earlier to help people navigate that information stream. 100%. I agree with that.
Fantastic. Well, as always, Karen, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
It was a pleasure, as always. I always enjoy chatting with you and seeing your posts, which have always inspired me.
Oh, thank you. Karen, thank you again for joining me. Much appreciated, and I always love our conversations. Head to our show notes at nobullshitvegan.com/160 to connect with Karen. And don't forget to get your hands on our free nutrition resources at karinainkster.com/resources. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to the No Bullshit Vegan podcast at nobullshitvegan.com.